Have you ever sat in that heavy silence at a family dinner? Here on Women's Diaries Voice, we retell those moments, honest every day, sometimes controversial. Every story is a mirror. Subscribe, join the conversation, and maybe find a little healing. I stood beneath the ribs of St. Bridget's nave, where the ceiling gathered the morning light, and dropped it down in pale sheets across a polished casket. The air smelled like salt dragged in from Seaford Bay, and candle wax warmed by breath. On the front pew, a program lay open on my lap, Richard Whittaker, 1959-2025. My father. The serif letters were clean and expensive, the kind of print he would have approved, unfussy, confident, sure of itself. People filed past, as if the aisle were a runway and grief a dress code. Developers in dark suits, a councilwoman in navy with a stitched flag on her lapel, our parish priest moving softly as if the carpet itself might bruise. I watched them greet my brother Evan with handshakes that lasted a beat too long. He stood near the aisle like a maitre d', rotating through grim smiles and tightly folded condolences. When his eyes found mine, they skipped away, as if looking too long might invite a crack. The program lifted in the slight draft from the doors, pages whispering. On the back, a bio described Richard's visionary leadership and public-private revitalization. There was a full paragraph on Evan, vice president of Whittaker Urban Partners, his awards, the mentorship he'd received, the fellowship he'd endow in his father's honor. My name was tucked near the bottom, Maya Collins' daughter. No mention of my work. No mention of anything besides being a noun, Sloane. My father's second wife arrived late, and perfect gloved in cream, and carrying a grief that photographed well. She kissed the cheek of a donor and drifted toward me, stopping short of actual contact. "Maya," she said, as if it were a new word, "you look strong." The pause did the heavy lifting. "I'm here," I said. At the end of the pew stood a man in a charcoal suit whose face I knew only from letterhead Caleb Ortiz, the estate attorney. He nodded a private gesture that felt like a rescue rope thrown from a quiet boat. "Ms. Collins," he murmured, leaning just close enough to be heard over the organ. "Mr. Whittaker left instructions for this afternoon. A message to be played at the house. I'll explain after the service." From his inside pocket, he showed a glint of red wax on a small envelope, then slid it away before the room could notice. "Not drama procedure." The choir rose and the room followed. Hymns lifted familiar melodies that skimmed across the casket lid and fell back in pieces. When it came time for eulogies, the microphone found men who owed my father money, or favors, or both. Their stories were polished just like the program. They spoke of risk and grit, and a handshake that meant the same thing as ink. No one said he could be difficult, that he ran his life like a ledger, and placed people under columns, asset, liability, undecided. Evan wrapped his fingers around the pulpit as if it were the neck of a bottle he didn't want to drop. His voice came out clean, then grew theatrical, paced for the back row. He spoke about legacy like it was a baton, and he, the chosen runner. He said, "we," each time he meant I. Somewhere in his speech, he looked directly at me, and I felt the old geography of our childhood redraw itself as lane, my lane, a rope of yellow buoys between us. After the recessional, the procession of cars cut through town toward the bluff, where the Whittaker house kept its view of the bay. The house was all angles and glass, a geometry lesson that caught weather like a net. Inside, everything worked hard to look effortless: caterers in black-white flowers leaning at mathematically casual angles, a jazz trio playing songs with no edges. On a sideboard, copies of the obituary fanned like swatches. The line about me was there again, accurate, small. Aunt Lorraine found me before anyone else could. My father's aunt had a voice like sanded oak, and a way of patting your arm that made you feel catalogued and kept. "Don't let the pageantry confuse you," she said, eyes bright. Richard's stubbornness wasn't the same thing as certainty. "I'm not here to argue with a building," I replied. "Good," she said. "Buildings don't argue. They just outlast the wrong stories." She moved on collecting plates and stray napkins, as if purpose could be tidied. Across the room, Evan worked the cluster of city people with choreographed warmth. He was handsome, in the easy way money gives a face nothing to do. When our paths finally crossed by the fireplace, he angled his body so the circle would hear. "You made it," he said. I did. For today, he added soft, but pitched to carry. "For our father's funeral," I said. The phrase steadied me like a handrail. His mouth smiled, but his eyes sharpened. "Let's call it what it is, Maya. You're here for the estate." Conversation in the room thinned. The trio skipped a beat. Glass chimed against a table, then settled. In the hush, I could hear the bay distant gulls a horn from the ferry line, the slow throat clearing of a tug farther out. "I'm here," I said evenly, "because this is where I'm supposed to be." Sloane's hand landed on Evan's sleeve, a stage cue. He shrugged it off, gaze still pinned to me. Dad was clear about his plans, he said louder now. He wanted continuity. The word hung their continuity like tape across a doorway. I did not step through it. "You can keep your version," I said. "I'll keep mine." "What version is that?" he asked, eyebrows lifting into innocence. "The one where grief is private," I said. He laughed without sound, the kind of laugh that hums in the jaw. "You always were good at turning an exit into a principle." Across the foyer, Caleb cleared his throat not to interrupt, but to change the weather. The trio recovered notes, landing where they belonged. He waited until the room remembered it had other things to do, then approached. "Forgive me," he said to both of us, though his eyes moved between Evan's posture and my pulse. "I'm following Mr. Whitaker's instructions. There's a recorded message to be played in the library at 4 o'clock for family, and for those specified by name. It's a matter of procedure." "Procedure," Evan repeated, as if testing whether the word would obey him. "I wasn't told about any recording." Caleb didn't apologize. "You're being told now." Sloane drifted forward, a breeze scented with white gardenia. "Is this necessary?" she asked, which meant, "Is this going to be inconvenient?" "It is required," Caleb said, which meant yes. He moved away, leaving the idea behind like a place card. "I walk the rooms the way you tour a museum where you've grown up touching nothing, remembering everything." On the bookshelves, awards bore my father's name in bronze and smoke glass. In the hall, photographs stitched a timeline, groundbreakings, ribbon cuttings, a mayor's smile that didn't reach her eyes. There were frames of Evan and Richard shaking hands. Evan and Richard in hard hats, Evan and Richard, under a banner that said Seaford Rises. Somewhere, probably boxed in a closet, there were pictures with me in them. Or not. In the kitchen, a caterer handed me a glass of water, with the kind of compassion people save for strangers. I drank it down like a dare. Through the window, the bay breathed out and in. The tide had turned imperceptible until it wasn't dragging a seam of wet light along the rocks. A woman I half recognized from the planning commission nodded at me, then looked past me for someone more useful. I was calibrated to that kind of glance from 1,000 small rooms. Invisible is a skill, if you call it by its other name, freedom. At 10 to 4, the house shifted. Conversations tightened their loops. People who mattered to the reading collected their coats and then remembered they didn't need them. Caleb stood at the mouth of the corridor that led to the library, one hand on the frame, as if he were stewarding a threshold that wasn't his to own. I didn't look for Evan. I didn't look for Sloane. I didn't look for the version of my father that had been printed and distributed this morning. I walked toward the library because my name was my name, and because for all the noise and velvet and glass, there are rooms you enter, because leaving them would be a kind of lie. The bay sent a new smell through the vents, wet rope diesel metal cooling in shade. I caught it and kept walking. I stayed. The library kept the afternoon like a museum jar keeps air. Oak paneling dark as tea. A rug so thick my shoes hummed instead of clicked. The bay lined the windows in a moving striped steel gray with a seam of foam where wind stitched it. I came early and sat in the wingback that faced my father's desk, the chair he'd chosen for negotiations and refusals. It smelled faintly of leather and pencil shavings, the scent I'd always thought of as his when I was small enough to nap on the couch while he corrected numbers with a gold-nibbed pen. On the desktop, everything aligned itself, a blotter without a wrinkle, a square of coasters, a tray of paper clips that looked poured rather than placed. One drawer was imperfect, eased in, but not flush. I touched the knob and it slid open like a held breath. Inside legal pads with the first 3 lines of headings filled, and the rest abandoned an envelope of spare keys, a palm-sized recorder and brushed aluminum. No password screen, just a slider old-fashioned enough to work by will alone. I set it in my palm and pressed play. My father's voice came out thin through the tiny speaker, ordinary and unguarded, in a way I hadn't heard since I was 8. "Thursday early," he said. Paper rustled. "Marina lease renewed under Harrow. Keep it separate." A pause, the scratch of a pen. Note to self, the tide tells the truth. Make the case clean. The slider clicked back to silence. I pressed stop and put the recorder where it had been, then closed the drawer snug against the desk. Harrow. I knew the name the way you know a street you've never walked down, but pass often enough to memorize. It had appeared once on a gallery invoice R. Harrow buyer of 2 pieces from a show that paid my rent for 3 months and convinced me to keep painting after a winter of space heaters and canned soup. The dealer had said he was a private collector who preferred the marina to the mainland. I'd pictured a sailor with windburned cheeks and a collection of wooden ducks. I'd pictured anything but my father. When I was 8, my mother quiet, precise, with a laugh that arrived like a tide was taken from the calendar by a disease that never apologized. The house lost its center and became a place where lights were left on in rooms without people. My father learned to sleep in shirt sleeves on the couch with the news droning waking at 2, to write notes to himself he couldn't read at 7. He stopped calling dinner dinner and started calling it late. He congratulated me on mastering long division and forgot that I hated raisins and oatmeal. I learned to perform weather reports on his face the way the harbor pilots read a sky. By the time I was 12, Evan had figured out that the straightest line to our father's approval ran through the office. He kept his hair tidy, brought home varsity letters, and read the Wall Street Journal with a practiced frown. He let my father see him reading it. I folded sketchbooks into the pocket of my backpack and drew the same breakwater 100 times looking for a way through the rocks. Senior year, a letter with a watermarked crest arrived, and the world narrowed to a doorway I knew how to walk through, Rhode Island. School of Design is pleased. The envelope trembled in my hand so hard the words blurred. That night, I set the letter by my father's plate the way you place a torch on a dark path so no one can claim they missed it. He read it twice, face blank. "We can celebrate," I said. "There's a scholarship. Not full, but—" He laid the letter down and smoothed the tablecloth. "Art is a hobby," he said the sentence so even you could level a picture with it. "Business is a life." Evan looked at me over his water glass with the party smile he wore at home when he wanted witnesses. "He's not wrong, May." "I didn't ask who was wrong," I said. "I asked if we could celebrate. We didn't." I took the acceptance, the partial scholarship, and 3 part-time jobs. By August, I was in a room in Brooklyn where the radiator made noises like an old man talking in his sleep. In the mornings, I tamped espresso for commuters who couldn't meet my eyes before 9. In the afternoons, I taught watercolor to kids who wanted dragons that breathed glitter. At night, I stood at a secondhand easel and tried to catch light in the brass ring of a desk lamp. Details from that time remain in my body the way a fall remains in a knee, the weight of a 5-pound bag of flour on my bisago basket, the way gesso smells like a clean promise, the rhythm of trains under the street metal breathing in and out. I learned a city by foot and a craft by stubbornness. I learned what silence meant when it arrived from home like a weather system. No calls, no congratulations, no disapproval either, just a blank. Then there was the group show that winter when the gallery heater could not compete with the door and the cheap red wine had to work alone. I sold 2 harbor pieces to R. Harrow, a name the dealer praised as if it were a brand, not a person. The check cleared. I bought better brushes and paid the overdue on my gas bill. It didn't occur to me that the buyer might be someone who had already paid for my childhood, months amassed into a life. I learned to stretch canvas over a frame without swearing. I learned which corners of the city stayed kind after midnight. I learned that a little hunger could keep a painting honest. And then 8 months ago, my phone lit with a number I hadn't stored because it seemed safer not to. "Hi, Maya?" My father said, voice smaller over a line than I remembered in a room. "It's Richard." He never called himself Dad on first contact. There was a distance he liked to close later, as if the word were a bridge that could collapse if we all stepped on it at once. I looked at my hands, paint on the knuckles, Prussian blue circling a thumbnail, and sat down on the floor. "I saw your show," he said, "last month, Westbrook Gallery. You were there." "I was." A pause. "I didn't know how to approach you without turning it into a scene." He cleared his throat. "The light in those harbor pieces is true." The word true did something strange in my chest. "It's the same light," I said, not sure if we were talking about Seaford Bay, or my mother, or a morning we had both lost. We talked for longer than we had since I was a girl, carefully, as if words were tiles we were laying for other people to walk on later. He asked about my work and truly listened. He remembered a creek off the marina where minnows turn like silver punctuation. Before we hung up, he said, "When you're in Seaford, stop by. There are a couple of matters I'd like to discuss in person. Company things, family things." His voice went softer, then steadied. "And I owe you better than I've given. We met 3 times that summer. Not at the house, never at the house, but in neutral places where conversation didn't echo. Once on a bench by the public pier with 2 coffees going cold. Once at a diner off Route 1 where the waitress called him sweetheart, as if she'd known him before the suit. Once in the park where a child's kite kept burning for the ground and lifting anyway. He was cordial in the way people are when they are practicing closeness, not yet ready to risk warmth. He watched gulls work a seam of breadcrumbs with the attention he used to reserve for slides in a boardroom. He asked questions that were specific. He said, "Your mother would have liked that sky," and I looked at the sky and tried to see it as a person would not a subject. 3 weeks before the church organ played him out, his heart broke its own rules at a bid council meeting downtown. I heard the news from Caleb Ortiz, who called my number with the gravity of someone who has rehearsed a sentence and hates every word in it. The train from New York to Seaford ran along marsh that looked stitched by geese. I counted phone towers to keep my hands from shaking. At the house, Grief wore a tuxedo and had a catering staff. Sloane floated. Evan steered, Aunt Lorraine anchored, and I made myself small enough to pass through rooms without knocking over the story other people told. In the quiet between condolences, I walked hallways. In the alcove outside the library, a travel tube leaned against a console table, gray cap tight, a label curling. Marina Storage 2B in my father's hand. I didn't touch it. A movement at the doorway drew my eye. Nina Morales, my father's executive assistant, stood with a stack of folders pressed to her chest like a shield. 20 years with him had given her the posture of a person used to catching things before they hit the floor. "I thought you might be here," she said. Her voice carried kindness and exhaustion in equal parts. "He always ended up in this room when he needed to think. This room knows all his thoughts," I said, then wished I hadn't given the room that power. Some of them, she said, a half smile that didn't crack her professionalism. She adjusted the folders. "If you need a quiet minute, I can divert traffic." "I'm fine," I said, which meant I was a person with a spine and also a person who wanted permission to sit down. She nodded and stepped aside, letting the hallway flow past, as if she were a rock in a stream. On the mantel, photographs had been rearranged into a narrative that excluded detours. Groundbreaking's ribbon cuttings. Evan in hard hat and grin. A smaller frame faced slightly away. I turned it a fraction the way you straighten a painting in someone else's house and then pretend you didn't. My father looked out from a boat wind in his hair, a hand on my head, my braid, a dark rope across a life jacket, both of us squinting into a light that overexposed the edges of our faces. Whoever curated the walls had missed this one. The grandfather clock in the corner gave a soft preparatory sound springs waking for their job. The house adjusted chairs finding angles, voices lowering to room tone. I stood, smoothed the skirt of a dress borrowed from my better life, and glanced once at the desk. Drawer, flush recorder, sleeping the smell of pencil and leather settling back into the wood. I opened the library door to the corridor where the carpet ran like a river toward the voices gathering. The window caught the bay at a new angle. Out on the water, a tug shifted its weight, and the wake reached the rocks, then drew back, leaving a line of darker stone. The tide marked the day without asking for permission. I stepped into the hall and joined the others. The library had filled itself by the time I stepped in soft bodies, in soft fabrics absorbing sound, a hush stitched tight as a hem. Evan staked out the high ground behind my father's desk, fingers drumming the edge of the blotter, as if the wood might answer back. Sloane folded herself onto the leather sofa with a grace that dared anyone to call it performance. Aunt Lorraine took the wing back near the fireplace spine-straight handbag propped like a verdict. By the door, Nina Morales stood the way longtime assistants do when rooms get dangerous, still alert, ready to catch what falls. Caleb Ortiz wheeled in a small cart with a flat screen and a squat media box, the cords wound and rubber-banded as neatly as a case file. He set an envelope with red wax beside the monitor, but didn't touch it yet. "Thank you for coming," he said, voice pitched to the room rather than the people in it. Per Mr. Whitaker's written instructions, we will first view a recorded statement, then proceed to the formal reading of the will. For clarity, this is not a novelty. It is a legal instrument tied to estate provisions. Evan made a noise that wanted to be a laugh and decided to be a scoff. Since when does a will need a movie, Caleb? Since your father required it, Caleb said. He lifted a small object wrapped in felt, the kind of care that tells you the thing inside matters. He unrolled it to reveal a slim SD card, the red edge catching light. This recording is mirrored to a secure server with a timed release. If the playback is interrupted, or the device is tampered with, a duplicate dispatches automatically to the district attorney and to counsel for the Whitaker Foundation. He set the card into the slot. It's designed to finish what it starts. A flicker moved across the screen, then steadied into an image of this very room. The framing was unadorned. My father at his desk, jacket off shirt sleeves, rolled the tie loosened in a way I rarely saw in public. He looked tired in a way that didn't seek pity. Tired like a man paying down an old debt with interest. If you're seeing this, he said, then I didn't get to say the rest while I was still useful. He paused, not for drama, but for breath. Caleb, thank you. Please ensure this is played in the presence of those I named. He shifted papers, aligned them, unaligned them. 1,000 meetings had taught his hands to organize the world into yes and no. They didn't know what to do with regret. Maya, he said, and the room narrowed to a single syllable. I owe you an apology that uses the right words, and all of them. I mistook control for care. When you chose the life you knew was yours, I called it a mistake because it didn't look like mine. I have watched your work from a distance out of pride, and if I'm honest, out of cowardice. It was easier to make my certainty a wall than to admit it might be wrong. Evan shifted behind the desk, but the chair didn't squeak. Sloane's throat moved like she had swallowed a stone. I bought 2 of your harbor pieces last year. My father said, the faintest shade of embarrassment in his voice. Under a name I use for privacy. R. Harrow. He exhaled, once a private kind of laugh. They hang at the marine apartment where the light makes sense of them. The line of my breath went ragged. Harrow arranged itself with the clarity of a puzzle I should have solved and chose not to. My father squared his shoulders the way he did when a conversation had to leave comfort. There are other things less simple. For the past 9 months, I have conducted with Caleb and an external forensic accountant an examination of irregularities at Whitaker Urban Partners. What began as a question about change orders on the Bayline Commons project widened into something systematic. Inflated invoices routing through layered LLC's vendor entities with no employees beyond a mailbox and a registered agent. He slid a folder into view and rested his hand on it. The gesture was almost tender. We followed the paper. We followed the signatures. We followed the emails you don't expect anyone to read. The findings are not vague. He looked straight into the camera. That old boardroom intensity carried none of its usual swagger. Evan, he said. I wanted what every foolish father wants, proof that the person who shares my name will also share the burden of my work. I mistook speed for talent. I mistook proximity for trust. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The shell contracting entities that captured inflated change orders on Harbor East Bayline Commons and the Seaford Pier Rehabilitation Harbor. East Holdings, North Gray Contractors. Sable Line, Logistics, resolve back to you or to people who resolve to you. The bank transfers are documented. The signatures that pretended to be mine are not mine. The meetings you told me were necessary weren't necessary for the projects. They were necessary for the diversion. Evan's hands clenched on the blotter, the tendons in his wrist sharp as wire. This is absurd, he said to the room too loud for the screen to ignore. My father in the recording didn't hear him. The past had already spoken. What causes me the most shame, he said, is not the money. It is the smaller sabotage. I believed my daughter had chosen silence. I have learned that messages did not always reach where they were sent. Calendars were shaped to avoid crossings. Filters were set. A person who knew my habits arranged opportunities for me to miss my child. He closed his eyes. That is a theft that doesn't balance. Sloane's finger slipped into her purse and then out again empty. Aunt Lorraine's gaze went to Evan and did not flinch. The tide tells the truth, my father said quietly. When it goes out, you see the posts you thought were pilings and learn some are only driftwood wedged in sand. I have delayed speaking plainly because I needed an airtight case. I could not accuse my own son in public and fail to meet the burden of proof. He tapped the folder without looking at it. Caleb holds the documentation. Originals are secured off-site. The forensic analysis is replicable. If you cooperate, restitution can be negotiated. If you do not, the law will do its work. My name is not a shield I will allow you to use. Evan pushed back from the desk as if the wood had bitten him. Turn it off, he said to Caleb. This is an insult to a dead man. Caleb didn't move. If the playback is stopped, the server sends the file to the DA and to Foundation Counsel. Your father arranged it that way. His voice held no heat, only fact. Let it finish. On the screen, my father's attention returned to me. Maya, he said, and softened. You don't need my permission for the life you've built. I owe you presence and the truth. You will find pieces of that truth in the objects I kept and didn't know how to display. I handled affection badly, but I kept what mattered. He straightened the pages in front of him, and for a moment his profile looked like the young man in a photograph. I remembered hair lifted by a bay wind, eyes narrowed against bright water. Caleb, he said, after this statement has been viewed in the library, please proceed to the will. Read it as written. For those who think money tells the story, it doesn't. It only pays the printer. The story is the work we repair. He nodded once to the camera, a gesture I had seen close dozens of meetings, then reached forward. The screen froze on his hand, then dimmed to black. Silence has grades. This one was the kind that makes furniture aware of itself. I heard the clock breathe. I heard the bay working at the rocks. I heard the low electrical hum of the monitor deciding whether anything else was required of it. Evan went first. He stood too quickly, the chair skidding and then catching the rug. You all saw that, he said, and tried for scorn but found panic. A posthumous smear. He's gone. He can't be questioned. It's convenient. Caleb opened his briefcase and set 4 folders on the desk. Too thick, too thin. Vendor registrations, he said, touching the first. Wire transfers and endorsements the second. Email chains and metadata the third. Audio exhibits the fourth. He didn't push them toward anyone. They knew where to look. Nina stepped forward, careful with her words, the way she was careful with everything. There were rules on Mr. Whitaker's email account I didn't write, she said. Filters that move messages with RISD or Westbrook Gallery to an archive labeled MISC. I found them when he asked why he wasn't seeing certain correspondence. I brought it to him. He had Caleb change the passwords and start a trace. She looked at me. There were calendar entries adjusted after meetings were scheduled. A recurring 15-minute hold called Coastline that only showed up from Evan's login. Evan's face flushed that specific red reserved for public unraveling. You're lying for money you don't have yet, he said to Nina, and then realized what he'd admitted about the money and tried to steer out of the sentence. This is an ambush. Stop, Aunt Lorraine said, not raising her voice. Richard has done what he can. Don't inherit his mistakes and call them yours. Sloane stood smoothing the front of her dress in a motion that looked like erasing chalk. I'm contacting counsel, she said to Evan, choosing a grammar that didn't include my father's name. We need advice. You need a conscience, Aunt Lorraine said, still mild, and the softness made it hurt more. Caleb broke the quiet with the smallest possible sound, the whisper of wax as he lifted the envelope. He held it where everyone could see the unbroken seal, then cut it clean with a letter opener that looked like something my father would have kept close. Last will and testament of Richard A. Whitaker, he read. The legal grammar made a new atmosphere. I'll summarize where permissible and read verbatim where required. He began with standard territory debts to be settled, taxes to be paid, bequests of personal items noted in an attached memorandum. Then the document turned toward the people in the room with a precision that made my scalp tighten. To my daughter, Maya Collins, he read, I devise and bequeath my personal fine art holdings, including but not limited to works acquired under the pseudonym R. Harrow, together with the leasehold improvements and contents of the Seaford Marina apartment. I further established the Collins Fellowship for Emerging Artists, endowed at a level described in Schedule C, with administration through the Whitaker Foundation. In addition, I transferred to Ms. Collins 22% of my shares in Whitaker Urban Partners to be held directly. The room adjusted around the number. It didn't feel like a prize so much as a door that had just been installed in a wall. Evan made a small, involuntary sound, then coughed it into something less revealing. To my son, Evan Whitaker. Caleb continued. I bequeath 18% of my shares in Whitaker Urban Partners to be placed in a voting trust for a period of not less than 7 years, administered by an independent trustee panel comprised of individuals named in Schedule D. Distributions from said trust shall be contingent upon full cooperation with internal and external investigations into financial irregularities described in Exhibit 4 and upon the completion of restitution under terms negotiated by counsel. Evan took a step forward, as if proximity could revise diction. My own father, he began, and Caleb did not look up. Legal language has a way of proceeding whether anyone likes it or not. The remaining 60% of my WUP shares. Caleb read, shall be allocated as follows: 30% to the Whitaker Foundation for Arts and Public Works to be held as an endowment with restricted use for community arts public infrastructure partnerships and scholarships, and 30% of net operating profit from WUP projects for the next 3 fiscal years shall be directed to the Seaford Community Restitution Fund, a charitable trust for the benefit of neighborhoods adversely impacted by cost inflation and project delay as defined in Exhibit 7. The arithmetic removed Evan from control without banishing him from responsibility. It folded the company toward oversight and the town toward repair. Caleb moved through other distributions, smaller bequests to longtime employees, the donation of a set of architectural archives to the County Historical Society, specific instructions about a parcel of marshland my father wanted kept wild. Paper whispered. The clock measured the room. When he finished, he set the will down and reached for the thinner of the 2 remaining folders. There are letters, he said softer now. Personal. They will be delivered privately. Evan found his voice again and aimed it at me. You cannot possibly think this stands, he said. He recorded a performance. You. He realized too late that there was no sentence beyond the accusation anyone would respect. I didn't answer him. There are conversations you don't have with someone who's chosen an audience over a listener. Nina looked at Caleb. Do you want me to bring in the acknowledgement pages? In a moment, he said. He turned to Aunt Lorraine. Would you like a chair closer to the door? I prefer this one, she said. It lets me see the whole family at the same time. Sloane's phone glittered in her hand. She typed, looked up, typed again. The version of grief she had worn all morning slid off in one clean movement and hung on an invisible hook. Evan planted his hands on the desk and leaned as if he could will it to tilt toward him. I ran this company at his side, he said. Those shares are mine by function, if not by paper. You ran it fast, Nina said quietly. That's not the same thing. He turned on her, and whatever he meant to say rearranged itself when he met the steadiness in her face. He backed away half a step, then half a step more. Caleb gathered the folders and closed his briefcase with a click that sounded like something concluding, though not ending. He didn't reach for hands or offer platitudes. Lawyers know which words belong to them and which don't. The room exhaled. People stood or didn't. Fabric whispered. Somewhere out beyond the glass, a tug shifted and the wake reached the rocks, and then retreated, leaving the stones darker for a while. I stayed where I was, my palm on the wing of the chair, the grain of the wood warm under my skin. The screen reflected the library, back at itself empty now of my father, and full of the arrangements he'd left. Caleb slid the will back into its folder and produced a thinner packet with tabs the color of traffic lights. Nina moved quietly among us with acknowledgement pages and pens, her steadiness giving the room something to balance on. Aunt Lorraine signed with a slow, legible hand and returned the pen as if returning a favor. Sloane's signature was a whisper, quick, pretty, practiced. Evan did not sign. He stood with both palms braced on the desk like a man trying to stop a tide with furniture. You won't get away with this, he said, and then heard himself and adjusted. My father won't be rewritten by a recording and a stack of PDFs. Caleb didn't look offended. He had the expression of someone counting. No one is rewriting him, he said. We're following instructions. He placed the thin packet in front of Evan. This is a standstill and cooperation agreement. It preserves records, suspends discretionary expenditures, and outlines access for the independent trustee panel named in the will. Signatures today prevent an emergency injunction in the morning. You want me to cuff myself to a desk, Evan said. I want you not to burn the building down while we walk out of it, Caleb said, and for the first time there was something like heat in his voice. Sloane reached for the packet, skimmed the first page, and slid it back. You'll send this to my counsel, she said, a sentence that left the plural ambiguous on purpose. Nina at the doorway cleared her throat. The board has been notified, she said to Caleb without looking at Evan. They can convene tonight. Caleb nodded. Conference room at the office, 8. The library exhaled us into the hall, where the house resumed its imitation of grace. A few remaining guests pretended they had been admiring the molding. A caterer in black carried a tray of crystal glasses into a room where no one was thirsty anymore. Evan caught up to me at the bottom of the stairs. You think this makes you something you're not, he said too close. You think a number on paper can give you a name. It gives me a seat, I said. Names come from elsewhere. He smiled without joy. You still speak like a brochure for a life no one buys. Aunt Lorraine stepped between us with the casual precision of a person changing lanes. Evan, she said, you're talking to your sister in your father's house after your father's funeral. Decide who you want to be in this sentence. For a second he looked like he might push past her. He didn't. Something in him measured the room, the witnesses the weight of the day, and fell back into scorn because it cost less. He turned on his heel and left a shape in the air that took a long time to fade. Night set in with the speed of coastal weather. At Whitaker Urban Partners, the boardroom had been polished for years to reflect certainty. A long table that could have landed a small plane, a view of the harbor, framed like proof. Tonight, the glass reflected faces rather than water directors in narrow ties, a project manager in a borrowed blazer, an accountant with a highlighter still in her hand from a day that hadn't finished. Caleb called the meeting to order and read the relevant clauses. Nina distributed binders so knew the spines cracked. Evan took his place at the end of the table and treated the chair like a witness hostile enough to deserve it. We'll need an interim chief executive. One director said the word interim landing like a lifesaver on a choppy surface. Eyes tilted toward me, and then away as if I were a candle that might burn, or might go out. I'm not a manager of buildings, I said before anyone could cast me in marble. Keep me on the foundation side. Give the company to someone whose hands know where the load-bearing is. There was a beat in which people translated that into a motion they could vote on. Caleb named a short list. The board debated without drawing blood. They voted in a woman named Evelyn Cho, who had rebuilt 2 battered firms without turning them into monuments to herself. The decision felt like a door opening in a room that had been too warm for too long. Evan laughed once short. You'd hand our name to a stranger. The name is not furniture, Aunt Lorraine said from a visitor chair. You can't scratch it by moving it. The cooperation agreement went around the table. Evan didn't take the pen. Caleb set it in front of him and waited. The clock on the wall made a noise that sounded like patience wearing down. Outside the harbor put its neon on. Finally, Evan signed angrily beautifully, the way he did everything that could be photographed. Caleb countersigned with a neat workmanlike flourish. Nina collected the papers like a nurse collecting vials. In the morning, the building on Bayline, where tenants had watched costs rise and schedules slip, hosted a town hall. Folding chairs fanned out from a microphone on a stand that someone had adjusted to chest height and then left crooked. The projector screen ghosted the company logo against a wall scuffed by years of rented events. Word had moved through text threads and church bulletins. A few reporters came because reporters find weather, and this counted. Evan stood with the posture of someone pretending he loved transparency. Evelyn Cho stood beside him with a notebook and an attention that cut through fog. Caleb opened with 3 sentences that refused to perform. He explained the restitution fund in terms that did not ask for applause. He turned the microphone over to a woman in a green work jacket who introduced herself as Layla Parkside admin for Harbor East. I flagged numbers, she said, hands steady on the stand. I sent emails. I have copies. When I raised it, my clearance for the invoice portal changed. I started printing things at night because sometimes in the morning the things were different. A man followed, shoulders square, jaw working. Theo Grant Project Accounting, he said, and the name meant nothing to the town and everything to the ledgers. I tracked change orders that made no structural sense. The pattern flowed through 3 vendor names that share an address with a mailbox store on the highway. I asked too many questions and was reassigned to a trailer with no heat in February. He didn't look at Evan. He looked at the room the way a person looks at shore after swimming too long. Questions came from the floor. A woman with a baby on her hip asked about the rent hikes that had followed delays. A man with a baritone said he had put his savings into a food cart meant for the boardwalk that hadn't opened on time because the promenade hadn't been poured when they said it had. The microphone moved like a prayer, making its way down a pew. Evan tried to triangulate contrition and control, but geography failed him. When a reporter asked whether he denied the company's name by his father existed, he said, "We retain contractors through accepted channels," which was not a denial, and the room heard the not. Evelyn took the microphone and spoke in the grammar of repair audits. Access timeframes, a number that would sit in a fund with a lock on it, and a list of keys taped to the glass. She didn't apologize for the past. She didn't ask the town to believe. She laid out a bridge and let people test it one step at a time. After, in the hallway that tried to be a lobby, Sloane appeared with a small, hard-sided suitcase the color of a pearl. She wore flats instead of heels and carried herself as if she were not trying to be tall. She didn't come to me or to Evan. She went to Caleb. "There's a packet for you," she said, as if commenting on the weather. "My counsel will file this afternoon." She touched her left hand like a person checking for a watch and found no ring to set straight. Then she left, not fragile, just finished. In the days that followed, the company learned to answer phones differently. Nina suspended a list of logins and changed the passwords at dawn while the servers were kind. The independent trustees took possession of a room with a door that had not been locked in years and locked it. The copier jammed and was unjammed. Staff who had been quiet to keep jobs became precise because precision had become a job. I spent more time than I admitted in the library, a room that had begun to be less a museum and more a place where paper meant things that weren't contracts. In the late light, dust thinned itself into a script I couldn't read. I opened the desk drawer to the recorder and pressed the slider again. "Friday," my father's voice said. "The Marina apartment needs a new lamp, the one with the brass arm. The tide tells the truth. Remember that when you pick the shade, you'll see everything twice in a window at night." He cleared his throat, and for a second I heard him not as an executive, but as a man alone in a room trying to decide whether he had earned the right to be hopeful. The recording clicked off. I didn't press it again. On the bookshelf, flanked by volumes about capital stacks and coastal zoning, a sketch leaned where someone had left it crayon on cheap paper, the breakwater drawn as a ladder, because I hadn't yet learned to make rocks. A small figure stood at the end of the pier with hair like a black flag. Beside the figure was a taller shape with a rectangle for a hand and a circle for a watch, because my father was always checking time. In the corner, in a child's effort at careful, I had printed Maya and then scratched it out and written it again straighter. I put the drawing on the desk blotter and smoothed its soft warp. The paper had kept the heat of some summer years ago and gave it back to my fingers. Late that afternoon, Seaford's light turned brass and then pewter. The bay took a breath big enough to hear. Out beyond the window, a tug nosed a barge past the point patient unromantic necessary. Inside, the clock on the mantel counted seconds toward an hour it didn't name. I stood in my father's chair and let the room hold me up. The grain of the wood ran under my palm like a map learned by heart. The house was quieter than it had been in days, not because nothing was happening, but because the noise had moved elsewhere to do what noise does. The lamp on the desk threw a clean circle. In it, the sketch looked less like a child's mistake and more like a promise the hand that drew it knew how to keep. The morning the doors opened, fog lifted off Seaford Bay like paper torn from glass. Inside the converted warehouse, the floors held the scent of new finish and fresh paint, and the walls kept a cool quiet the way galleries do when they understand their job. The sign above the entry read Harbor Light Arts Center. Letters cut from brushed steel that caught the weather and did not apologize for it. People came in clusters that made sense together. Dock workers in clean shirts, teachers with tote bags, the woman from the boardwalk who'd once lost a season's income to a late pour. 2 boys still in soccer cleats, a grandmother in a red coat, a handful of reporters who softened their voices because the space asked them to. Nina checked name cards with a pencil she'd sharpened herself and straightened frames no one else would have noticed were crooked. Aunt Lorraine arrived with flowers from her yard in a jar that refused to be self-conscious. She set them on the front desk like a flag, Caleb stood near the windows overlooking the water tie, a shade looser than the day in the library. He didn't make a speech. He nodded to me as if passing a baton that weighed nothing. Evelyn Cho came through the side door between a sight walk and a board call, placed a palm on the wall as if taking a pulse, and moved on with a notebook open to a page already half used. Layla Park from Harbor East and Theo Grant from accounting drifted in together, unfamiliar, in clothes that weren't worksite or winter trailer. When they caught my eye, they lifted a hand and then let it fall shy of ceremony. The exhibition was called Soundings. On one wall, a series of small canvases measured the harbor at different hours, dawn the color of a peeled apple. Noon punched hard by sun, midnight trimmed in ship lights. In the center, a larger piece held the room still, a field of water, scored with shallow cuts of white and zinc, a horizon that didn't need to prove it existed. A thin line of wharf where two figures stood, one taller. One with hair lifted by a wind you could not see but believed. I had painted it without trying to name them. Near the education rooms, 10 portfolios lay open on tables, the first cohort of the Collins Fellowship holding their work as if it might run. A girl in a denim jacket traced the edge of her charcoal drawing without touching paper. A boy with paint under his nails explained to his mother how a color gets warmer when it leans toward dirt. In a corner, a violin tested the air and decided it was safe. In the small office at the back, a brass arm lamp threw a circle on a desk that used to be a shipping table. I set 2 things beneath it, a photograph of my father on a skiff with his hand on my life vest. Both of us squinting into a light the camera couldn't discipline, and a crayon drawing of the breakwater I'd made when I thought rocks were ladders. A folded page lay between them. The letter Caleb had delivered days after the library. My father's handwriting cut clean, as if he'd drafted each line in his head before letting ink catch up. I read one sentence and stopped. Pick the shade carefully. At night you see everything twice in the window. Out in the main room, the sound of people added up to something generous. Soft shoes, low conversation, the small click of a camera shutter doing its job without making itself the subject. I stepped back to the windows. The bay had slipped to slack water, not going or coming, just holding. At the far point, a tug nudged a barge into alignment, and then let it go, patient as a hand teaching a child to ride a bike. Aunt Lorraine joined me and slipped her arm through mine. We didn't speak. The light changed and the letters over the door caught it, then gave it back. The tide marked the stones along the shore with a darker line, the way a pencil makes an outline before color knows where to live. I stood there until the new quiet felt like a room I could keep. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll see you next time as we continue exploring more journeys and lessons together.